My name is Rachel Salatis, and I am one of the facilitators of the racial justice team here at the McFarland United Church of Christ. And now I'm just so excited to introduce you to Reverend Kerri Parker. She's brilliant. She is a pastor. She's a teacher. She's a leader. She's a friend. So I'm excited to learn with all of you tonight from Reverend Kerri Parker. So thanks for being here, Kerri.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation to be with you all. I am wearing my hat as Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches tonight. I'll tell you a little bit more about the council in a couple of minutes. I have actually about an hour's worth of presentation tonight, and it is jam-packed with information. But we have saved room for questions afterwards, so please hold on to your questions, and we will have time for dialogue. Shall we pray together? Holy One, you who create, you who call peoples together, you who are a spirit of reconciliation among us. Help us to be people walking a good path. Help us to be people coming to work with good hearts and good minds and good intentions. We give you thanks for the work before us, even though the road that brought us here is a difficult one. Inspire us and lead us in hope, we pray. Amen. So, if you are here for the Land Acknowledgements Done Better presentation, this is what we are about tonight. I've got some slides for us. I'm going to put them up on screen, Zoom willing. I mentioned I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of Churches, just to let you know who that is. It's a network of people and organizations reaching across the state of Wisconsin, working together across lots of differences to address critical issues with creativity and courage. We connect 21 different Christian traditions, a whole bunch of faith-based organizations as well. That amounts to 2,000 congregations and faith-based and secular allies. If there is an issue in the state of Wisconsin that deals with the well-being of churches, pastors, marginalized peoples, in some way, we may be part of that conversation. And it's tremendously exciting work. Before we get to the what of land acknowledgements, we ask the why. Why are we engaged in this work of reconciliation and repair? And the best anchor scripture for this, as far as we're concerned, comes from the Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus says, so when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your sibling has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your sibling and then come and offer your gift. So in this teaching, if you remember, those of you who happen to be Christian, this comes in a section of the gospel that is a ginormous teaching on how we are supposed to live. It's also right next to the Beatitudes. Jesus is telling us nothing, if there is anything broken between us and our siblings, there is nothing more important than making that right. Not even our relationship with God. Put down your gift and go and fix the problem between you and your brother and your sister or your sibling. Dealing with me can wait. I want you to fix it with them. That's how important this teaching is. So as we go through this, think about your why and what brings you to this work. The Wisconsin Council of Churches land acknowledgement statement is called, "This is some of the story of the land we are on." It's only some. This is from the very end of the statement. We confess this truth and claim these commitments. Our ability to gather, worship, learn, and establish our presence as a church came at great expense to the original inhabitants of the land. We recognize their descendants. We honor their resilience. We commit to concrete actions that will begin to restore the distorted relationships between us. We owe attention, time, relationship, and resources to those from whom we have stolen so much. Please join us. There are many paragraphs before that talk about what has happened and to whom before we get to our so what statement, which is that piece. Think about your end goal and why you want to make a land acknowledgement statement. Is it because everybody's doing it? It's the thing to do? It feels like the right thing to do. Somebody told you you had to do it. Happens a lot. Hi, my regional church authority said I needed to have a land acknowledgement statement, or the university said our department had to have a land acknowledgement statement. And, oh, we have an anniversary coming up. We would like to have a land acknowledgement statement for our church anniversary, our organization anniversary coming up in 3 weeks. Perhaps we slow down because the process is more important than the end statement. Poet laureate Joy Harjo wrote, "All the stories in the earth's mind are connected." And if you remember nothing else from this presentation, I want you to remember the profound connectedness of all the things that we do and all the things that we talk about and all of these actions across time and relationship. Say connectedness with me. All the stories in the earth's mind are connected. From Northwestern University, we have a reminder that colonialism is a long-standing history that we have a place in. And it's not just back then. There's an ongoing process that we are still part of. It's not just a history class. It's also today. We are presently participating in colonialism. Another piece we need to remember, and anytime we're doing land acknowledgement work, we need to remember, again, this connectedness. The land and the people are one. You cannot separate one from the other in talking about either. This quote by Mary Lyons, "When we talk about land, land is part of who we are. It's a mixture of our blood, our past, our current, and our future. We carry our ancestors in us and they're around us." You can't say, "Oh, I'm just going to move these people here," as if it's okay. We are born on the land and we're placed in the land to rest. Body and blood are inseparable. To wound one is to wound the other. And when we try and sever that relationship, you're taking a part of a body away. You're creating these soul wounds that are lasting generations. When we talk about land acknowledgements, we're not just talking about land. We're talking about community and culture and ancestors and descendants. It's a whole bunch more than, oh, this was somebody's land. This map shows us a bit about what has changed in Wisconsin. The large colored areas are the state of tribal lands about the year 1800. The small bordered areas, square-ish, and the dots represent the area occupied by present-day Native nations. I always ask people to think here. What do you see? And what are you wondering about when you see this? Those of you who have come to a presentation by Mark Charles may be familiar with the doctrine of discovery. This is my crib sheet. 1452, Pope Nicholas V grants the King of Portugal general and specific powers to search out and conquer all pagans, enslave them, and appropriate their land and goods. And in this papal bull, this teaching, he says that we, fortified with divine love and summoned by the charity of Christians and bound by the duty of the pastoral office, which concerns the integrity and the spread of faith. This is the Christian doctrine, the Christian teaching, which underlies the work that is about to come. He continues to say that he is giving this edict so the king can send his people to invade, conquer, fight, subjugate lands, places, estates, camps, and any other possessions of Saracens, pagans, infidels, and the enemies of Christ, and lead their persons in perpetual servitude. This, together with Pope Alexander VI edict in 1493, becomes the basis for occupying the Western Hemisphere and the transatlantic slave trade, and eventually the foundation for the United States Western expansion. In 1823, church teaching gets tangled up with United States law. So Chief Justice John Marshall, United States Supreme Court, issues an opinion that holds that the principle of discovery, that's these two pieces here, gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands. Yes, the United States has a separation of church and state, and it's much more complicated than that. This doctrine is enshrined in United States and international law. It was last cited in 2005 in a Supreme Court decision by Ruth Bader Ginsburg against the Oneida Nation. This is not old history. This is today. This map comes from a website called nativeland.ca. And the overlapping swaths of color represent territories and peoples. You can pull up this map yourself. It is centered on current day Wisconsin. Over there on the left, you see Minnesota. Over there on the right, you can see a bit of Michigan. It's not as simple as clean lines and territories, is it? We like to map things and fix them in place. Things are a little bit more complicated. Next map. Here we have some languages. Look at the richness of peoples, cultures, languages, traditionally. Now, next map. All those little itty bitty words, which you might not be able to read if you're here in the room, but you might be able to read better if you are viewing this online, say session, C-E-S-S-I-O-N, and have a number after them. Session like seed, like you're seeding land. This is about the seeding of territory by a native group, a nation, or a group representing a nation to the government. Every time you see one of those words, it represents a treaty and the loss of land that had been occupied by indigenous peoples to settlers. This gets a little bit closer to home. Session 174, that dark grayish blob, represents the treaty that impacts this geographic area in Greater Madison and a little bit further up in Wisconsin. Think about how land has changed hands. And this is a little bit on the larger scale now. Session 174 was between the US government and the Ho-Chunk. If you go to native-land.ca and you enter in any address, you can find the land cession, the treaty related to any address. Then you can click through. Library of Congress has a great big book digitized of every single one of these treaties. Schedule of Indian land cessions. These were not voluntary. They were represented as voluntary, but there was a lot of force involved. So signed September 15th, 1832 at Fort Armstrong, Rock Island, Illinois, between the Winnebago, which was the name used for the Ho-Chunk at that time by the government, and the US. The Winnebago Nation hereby cede to the US all lands to which said nation have title or claim lying to the south and east of the full legal description. Basically, this was part of a larger movement to force the Ho-Chunk west of the Mississippi. This was one piece of that work. Now, in consideration of this cession, the US agrees to grant to the Winnebago Nation that part of the tract of country on the west side of the Mississippi River known as the neutral ground, description of the limits, to the line of a purchase made of the Sac and Fox tribes of Indians. Okay, well, where did they go? Again, west, west, west. here's the thing. Every time the United States tried to remove the Ho-Chunk from the state of Wisconsin, Ho-Chunk found ways to come back. The Ho-Chunk who are here today are the descendants of the resistors. So if you want a testament to resistance and resilience, today's Ho-Chunk people in Wisconsin are the folks to talk to. Large scale, we could be here all night just talking about the legacy of land cessions. But you can also get small scale thinking about how land has changed hands, because once it got into government hands, then it gets from the government to settlers. You can go to the Register of Deeds office in your county. So Dane County has stuff online. And if you're really geeky, you can go into the paper archives and you can track the history of any piece of land. Now, I've worked with a church that actually has the records of the farm family that got the land from the government, and the farm family gave the land to the church for development. They have a really easy trail, much easier than most of us. But then they have the question, now what do we do? Knowing this, we got this land for free. What do we do about stewardship? And what is our responsibility? Who was displaced from this land? And as people of faith, what is our responsibility in this situation? It is something they're wrestling with as they write their own land acknowledgement statement. So the reason you're here or viewing this is because you actually want to know, what's a land acknowledgement statement worth its salt? My best teaching on this comes from Mr. Bill Quackenbush, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Ho-Chunk Nation. And this simplifies a lot of the questions you may have. A solid land acknowledgement statement that is actually worth doing has 3 things in it. Number 1, it says what has occurred. I'd add, and may still be occurring. 2, to whom it happened. It didn't just kind of generally happen. It actually happened to somebody or somebody's. And 3, it includes a positive commitment to rectify the transgression. Now, most of us, when we hear land acknowledgements that leave out number 3. Don't leave out number 3, because then it is hurtful and meaningless. Don't even bother creating a land acknowledgement if you're going to leave out number 3. Otherwise, you're just stating history, and you're not working toward repair. My colleague, Mr. Quackenbush, also suggests you don't have to get long and laborious about this. Keep it around 100, 125 words. This is not an encyclopedia of all wrongs forever. This is a beginning. Specificity does matter. Again, this isn't a general, somebody did something wrong once. This is, we know something wrong happened here-ish. And maybe our ancestors or our organization or its predecessors have been part of it, or maybe we're part of the continuing legacy. Think about using present tense. 40%, I'm going to say this again, 40% of people in the US today do not believe that there are living indigenous people in America. Use present tense. when referring to Native peoples. That's one huge thing you can do. And then talk about your particular role and response. Think about, and this is why land acknowledgements take more than 5 minutes or 3 weeks to meet your next anniversary, right? Think about and talk about what feels especially important to name given your context. We are here in McFarland tonight. What do we know about McFarland? We know about the mound system. We know about the work around the schools. We know about McFarland's commitment to community. We know about, if this is McFarland United Church of Christ, we know about the congregational traditions, involvement in the boarding school system. Those are some things. Or, these other churches that I've worked with, what labor went into developing the land? What accumulation of assets were used to acquire it? What is your responsibility there? The positive commitment to rectify the transgression. Like, oh, those are some big words, right? What hard thing are we going to do directly connected to the brokenness to help begin the repair? That's what it amounts to. If it's easy, then we're probably not stretching hard enough. Like, oh, sure, we can have a book study. There is nothing wrong with the book study, and stretch harder. We can make a donation, okay? And what's a stretch? Always, what hard thing will you do to begin the work of a repair? When you break a bone or you sprain an ankle, that repair work in your body isn't easy. There is brokenness in the body of the community. We need to put effort into healing. There's some things that we might do that I can offer examples. I know of a group who did research on their faith ancestors and found out that they were heavily involved in the boarding school movement, and that there were many children who were sent to those boarding schools. And as part of their land acknowledgement statement, they listed all of the boarding schools that were part of their tradition. And they said their act of repair is to support programs that work to restore language and culture. Because the boarding schools systematically stripped away language and culture over generations. That was part of their explicit intent. The use of distasteful and harmful names, especially in the United Church of Christ tradition, there are plenty of churches named Pilgrim or Plymouth after the beginnings of what became a genocide, a deathly time of disease and horror for many Native people. And so would you want to be driving by a billboard nearly every day that brought that memory up? Or would you be interested in knowing that people cared enough about your pain to say, yes, that name is important to our heritage, but maybe not as important as your pain? A camp here in Wisconsin used to be called Pilgrim Center, and they worked with the Ho-Chunk Nation to rename themselves. and they're now called Dechola Center after the Ho-Chunk name for the lake at which they're located. And they're also working on the preservation of the mound systems that are located on that property as part of their action of repair. Now, that property has been developed for a century now, occupied by settlers, despite the fact that the mound systems have been there for over 10,000 years. And some of them have been damaged by the heavy use of that site. But you know better and you can do better. So now some of those mound systems are being fenced off and interpretive signage is there, and they're beginning to add programming to what they do at that camp to educate people about the cultural richness of what they're immersed in every day while they're on that site, and the fact that they are on a sacred site. And it goes beyond their own brief tradition. I talked about living as if Native people are past tense. Now, lots of us are living and worshiping and teaching on ceded land. We saw that map. There are lots of things we can do around that. There are folks who are doing shared stewardship. I mentioned the church with the farmland. There are folks who are thinking about land back if they have more land than they physically need. Some churches that are closing that are thinking about, can we turn over this property to Native communities? And some churches are doing what you might call voluntary rent payments or land taxes. And this is part of the land back movement as well. I know of a church on the west side of Madison that has commercially valuable property. And they said, we have been using this land for a long time, and it is not right that we use it without making some amends for our use of it for free without relationship. And so they put money into their operating budget every year, not their charitable budget, their operating budget. And they went to the Ho-Chunk and they said, we have this fund that we would like to make a contribution. And in conversation, the person they went to said, we would actually like to work with the Great Lakes Intertribal Council to create a fund so that all of us can benefit. Because we don't do this so one of us benefits, right? We do this work in relationship. And so now a fund has been created through the Great Lakes Intertribal Council where any church that wants to contribute can. And it supports the work of the tribal historic preservation officers who work on the repatriation of ancestors and cultural objects and help do things like teach people like us who want to learn. Just an example. I now have worked with 4 churches that are making contributions to that already, and this is just a brand new fund. So I know other churches that are investing specifically in a community investment program because it prioritizes Native community development financial institutions. It gets capital into communities that have been stripped of capital. There are lots of things that we can do. We just have to think hard about which slice of our world we want to start in. Sometimes people get overwhelmed and they're like, this is a great big ball of yuck. This is horror. This is centuries of horror that have been perpetrated. I have no clue where to begin. And it makes us freeze. How can I possibly start? And in any event, I wasn't here and I don't have any part of this. The answer is always we can start somewhere, right? This graphic comes from a group called Sacred Reckonings, and they're out of the Twin Cities. And I love their work, and I would commend it to you, but I will warn you that their free PDF is 250 pages, so you might not want to print it. Please care for the Mother Earth. What they remind us is that restorative practices lead to more restorative practices. So you start somewhere and it leads you to somewhere else. So you start with truth telling, perhaps, because, you know, maybe we know people who don't know truths because hard histories are things that can be difficult to teach these days, right? But if we're committed to truth telling as our restorative action, that's a thing we're going to do. But maybe truth telling leads us to deeper relationship with Indigenous folks. And maybe that leads us to a commitment to wealth return, that some of those things that I just talked about. And that leads us to a commitment to political solidarity. Brothertown Indian Nation here in Wisconsin is one of the 12 nations in Wisconsin, but they're not federally recognized. I think it was 1853, but I'd have to check the date. They gave up, maybe it was earlier. I'm sorry, I'm not really good with years off the top of my head. They gave up their federal recognition in order to become US citizens because they were tired of being forcibly removed. So their story touches my heart because I grew up on the East Coast, okay? Brothertown Indian Nation gathered on the East Coast from several tribal nations, and people who became Christians formed a community called Brothertown, right? And when things became untenable where they were, they moved in with the Stockbridge-Munsee Nation. The Stockbridge-Munsee eventually got relocated to live with the Oneida in New York. And then when it suited the US government to make things uncomfortable for the Oneida in New York, there were multiple ways that they got the Oneida into Wisconsin as part of this westward expansion. And that is a long and sordid story that, again, would keep us here all night. The church was involved. The Oneida, the Stockbridge-Munsee, and Brothertown were seen as friendly Indians to serve as a buffer against the unfriendly Indians. And so the US government said, let's move them here temporarily. But then the government wanted to move Brothertown again. And Brothertown said, will you stop moving us if we become US citizens? Government said, sure. US government said, okay, that means you've given up your sovereignty and your land and all of these other things. That is not the story that Brothertown understood. They are still today fighting for their sovereignty. It's going to take an act of Congress to get it back. One of our senators is willing to co-sponsor that act of Congress, but needs a co-sponsor from the other party. We know how Congress works. Political solidarity means standing with Indigenous peoples when they have struggles like that, when they have struggles like needing to pay to get into state parks, to visit their sacred sites for ceremony. Should that be the case? Needing to pay the Wisconsin state government as sovereign peoples to get into their sacred sites for ceremony. Political solidarity looks something like that. Talking about these things and working to change them. And then spiritual practice. How do we pray and accompany and invite and work to change our hearts? All of these things, this whole wheel, one thing leads to another. How can I see my siblings' pain? How can I not see the brokenness that exists between us and among us and not begin some restorative practice? Jesus says, if there's something wrong, put down your offering. Go work on things with your sibling. That's the offering I need. Got this whole list of actions being taken by Wisconsin churches. And again, overwhelming, so many possibilities. Where do I start? And I'm happy to talk with anyone about this. At the Wisconsin Council of Churches, we have resources. We workshop this. We can refer you to partners in the Indigenous community because we do not do this work alone. I'm not here as an expert. I'm just here as somebody who's trying. My 8th grade grandmother was in the settling generation in Quebec. She was a French woman from the orphanage, and they needed women to bear babies, and she married a soldier. That's part of my story and part of my why. And I say that not with guilt or shame, but because I've taken the time to find out. Do your homework. It's okay if it takes a while. Work on things together and expect to make mistakes. Here's an important thing. We want to rush. And when you find yourself wanting to rush, realize that if you're a white person, that is your whiteness talking. If you are not a white person, that is the whiteness that surrounds you talking. Double check, are your references past tense? Double check, are you uncomfortable? If you're not uncomfortable, why not? Take recommendations from your Native relations seriously and make changes if you need to. Here are some big words I didn't use earlier, but I want to bring up now as we're wrapping up. A land acknowledgement statement for a person of faith isn't just words. It's not just a public statement. It's theological. It's God talk. It's catechetical. It's a teaching tool. And it's liturgical. It's also an act of worship. It does all of those things. It's a very busy 100 words or so. Educate your community, make it a living document, and then go back to the beginning. This is an action reflection process. You're not doing it once and forever. If you ever find yourself saying, we did a land acknowledgement, catch yourself. We have a land acknowledgement statement, and we keep working on it. Progress over perfection. Always. I have to give thanks to my teachers. And so here, as we wrap up, I give thanks for Ada Deer, who spent time with me and who I had the honor to share meals with. And taught me about being a strong woman and a warrior who speaks for what's right. And she is walking with the ancestors now. So, the floor is open for questions.
When you were talking about the political, how did you put it? Political solidarity, yeah. Yeah, I think that should include their current, the tribe's current struggles
Absolutely.
right now. So things that
Yes.
are going on with like Line 5
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, seeing what we can do to support that as a church body.
Yes. There's another thing I can also suggest. Every year there is a State of the Tribes address in the Capitol. And if you cannot attend that in person, you can usually get a transcription of
Or watch it on
the speech or watch
public
it on
TV.
Wisconsin Eye or public television. And it is well worth your time. You can get a sense of priorities and interests that way, but nothing supersedes relationship. I mean, it's one thing to hear about things at a distance. It's another one to build relationships and have a friend tell you about what is directly impacting their life. There is advocacy that needs to happen on the federal level, on the state level, on the county level, and the local level. And not everybody can have their eyes in all places. And so all of us have to work together in order to work towards justice.
My Wennon, thank you. Um, I'm deeply humbled for all of you. Well, countless times as Native Americans have been put through atrocities and things that we've had to live through. And I want to commend all of you for being here and doing your part. There's a gentleman that wrote a book that's in this church. And in that book, it talks about a whole chunk being removed to Kansas. And he walked all the way back from Kansas, all the way up to Wisconsin Rapids, which was called Arpin, or as we know it as Skunk Hill. And that's where my grandfather was born. I mean, my grandfather was born in Kansas, but they moved up in that area. And they did, the Potawatomi or the Ho-Chunks did buy land up there. And now it's a state park. And because it's a state park, what had happened to them is they got removed off of there is because when they bought the land, they were not told of they had to pay taxes. So now they lost that land, and they still do not own it. Wood County owns the park, which is something that I would like to definitely get back to the native lands. My grandfather, my uncle that I'm named after. I was adopted out in a foster home. I lived in Seymour, and writing a book about my life. And one of the things, when I lived in my last foster home, I was going to have the family adopt me and change my last name. It wouldn't have been Shigoni, it would have been Worsch, which was a German name, which I didn't mind because they were a very loving family. I enjoyed them, and I lived in Seymour. And, but anyways, so after I got out of school and learned a little bit more about culture, my history, my family, and the two names that I got, I had 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and all of them are all gone now. I'm the last one. I am 65. And my grandfather was Charlie, and my uncle was named Arthur. So I got my name's William. My full name is Arthur William Shigoni. And both them names were chiefs of the Big Drum family, the Big Drum. And I've gotten stories about my grandfather about that drum, and they still hold those ceremonies. And one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to have one of the last chiefs that were up there. I had asked if maybe at some time that the Potawatomis could have a big drum ceremony back up there again. But the person that I had asked had passed away the summer after of a heart attack. But I'm going to still try to see if we can still do that. But that area up in Wisconsin Rapids, is Arpin area, where all the Native American tribes, spiritual leaders used to go to gather to hold big drum ceremonies. And when I came to this and heard you talk, I was very honored, and thank you very much for that. You did a tremendous job. And I hope that all the Indian nations can hold and hear what you've done for us. On behalf of my people, the Menominee and Potawatomi nations, I want to say Chi-miigwech, my Wanakatanen, to each and every one of you for your efforts and for your hard work, for being here. It means a lot to me and this community of McFarland. Thank you.
These last few things that have been spoken of bring to mind just a few points. One is that this is not necessarily a good news piece, but it's a reminder that lots of times, in history class, if we learn anything about Indigenous folks, like we think about something like the Cherokee Trail of Tears, realize that most Indigenous nations have some version of a trail of tears, right? The Ho-Chunk removals, the Potawatomi being moved. Caitlin Curtis talked a lot about that removal for the Potawatomi when she was a speaker for the Wisconsin Council of Churches a few years ago. The reason there's a Winnebago Nation in Kansas and Ho-Chunk here in Wisconsin is because of the removal of the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. These stories of forced removals are trails of tears. And there's not just one in the country. Another piece is to think about the stories of the displacement of individuals from their families. Art talked about being adopted out, right? And one of the big things that's happening in Indigenous communities is the funding of scholarships for people to go to law school so they can defend the rights of the nation, including helping to keep Indigenous children with Indigenous families. The tribal chair and vice chair of the town nation both work full-time in Indigenous family law. It's huge. That's a thing you can do. Reparations fancy. Initiatives like that to keep Native children with Native families means funding education for Native attorneys to do this work. And the third piece, I hear you talking about the preservation of sacred places and being able to visit them and the importance of doing that in community. Also want you to know folks who are working on the preservation of species that are important to Native culture. So you think about wild rice, particular wild rice strains that are more vital than the ones that are commercially produced, that are precious and sacred to particular communities. Black ash used in basket making. You know how your suburban tree is threatened by the emerald ash borer? The black ash, which is used in basket making, is also threatened by the emerald ash borer. There are folks actively working on all of these pieces. And whatever your interest is, or your niche group's interest is, there is probably an intersection with Indigenous justice. So there are ways to get engaged. I'm also available through the Wisconsin Council of Churches website. You can find me by way of the staff page, wichurches.org. So thank you, everybody.